California's logistics crisis did not begin with a dramatic explosion, a sweeping strike, or a sudden disaster plastered across cable news. It began quietly in the sterile language of a court decision that most Americans never read and journalists barely mentioned. Yet within days of that ruling, phones rang across dispatch centers from Sacramento to San Diego, and independent truckers, men and women who had spent decades hauling the freight that keeps America's shelves stocked, found themselves confronting the unthinkable. A state they had worked in their entire careers was no longer a viable place to operate. That is how an exodus began, not with headlines, but with silence, calculation, and a slow realization that the rules had changed faster than the industry could react. For years, the legal battle around Assembly Bill 5, referred to in the industry simply as AB 5, had been treated like a background noise, a distant policy fight whose consequences always seemed hypothetical. AB 5 was framed as a labor classification reform, a measure aimed at stopping companies from misclassifying workers as independent contractors to avoid providing benefits. In that context, the law resonated politically, especially in a state where organized labor still wielded influence and where gig economy companies had become cultural villains in the eyes of progressive legislators. But the trucking sector is not DoorDash, and a long-haul owner-operator moving freight across state lines is not a freelance courier delivering takeout across town. Policy, however, did not bother with those distinctions, and when the courts ruled that AB 5 applied fully to trucking, the legal conversation ended and the economic consequence. What makes this story particularly striking is not only the legal shock itself, but the speed in which the market reacted. Independent owner-operators, a class of small business entrepreneurs who buy, finance, maintain, and operate their own trucks, do not have the luxury of waiting for policy debates to settle. Their margins are thin, their costs are relentless, and their time is literally measured in miles. For them, AB 5 was not an abstract classification mechanism, it was a direct threat to the business model that allowed them to operate independently. Under the ABC test at the heart of the law, these drivers did not struggle with prong A or prong C. They failed at prong B, the requirement that their work be outside the usual course of the company hiring them. How does a trucker haul freight for a freight company and simultaneously be considered outside that company's core business? The answer legally was that they could not, and therefore the state effectively erased their independence. The impact landed fastest on the people least able to absorb it. Independent truckers began calling shippers, carriers, and freight brokers and hearing the same variations of one sentence: "We can't load you out of California anymore." For some, the shift felt like a rug being pulled out from under them. One week, they were hauling produce out of the Central Valley, moving loads of berries and lettuce that had to reach distribution centers on tight schedules. The next week, their phone was silent. No loads meant no revenue, and no revenue meant truck payments, insurance premiums, and maintenance costs piling up with no offsetting income. Trucking may be an industry built on movement, but financial deadlines do not wait for freight to reappear. The broader market reaction was not as chaotic as it was decisive. This was not irrational panic, but calculated withdrawal. Carriers ran compliance assessments and concluded that the cost of converting independent contractors into employees was economically impossible. Doing so would require absorbing payroll taxes, healthcare costs, workers' compensation, paid time off, and equipment expenses that owner-operators had historically shouldered themselves. A single employee converted truck could add tens of thousands of dollars in annual costs to a carrier's balance sheet. Multiply that by dozens or hundreds of drivers, and the numbers no longer penciled out. The result was not negotiation or compromise, but exit. To understand the magnitude of 70,000 independent truckers leaving California, one must understand what those drivers represent. They are not just workers, they are nodes in a complex logistical ecosystem. The United States supply chain is often compared to a machine, but that metaphor undersells its fragility. Machines tolerate downtime, supply chains do not. Delays cascade, ports congest, inventory evaporates, and prices climb. California uniquely sits at the heart of this system. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach together handle nearly 40% of all containers entering the country. Those containers do not offload themselves, and they do not move inland by wishful thinking. They move because an army of trucks shuttles them from docks to warehouses, from warehouses to rail yards, and from rail yards to final destinations across the nation. Remove trucks from that equation, and the system does not slow down, it stalls. The impact of the trucker exodus reverberated through the ports quickly. Terminal supervisors began noticing containers lingering longer than usual. The industry uses the term dwell time to measure this. A container that used to sit for one day now sat for 2 or 3. Add a few days of dwell time at the ports and suddenly warehouses struggle to plan labor, retailers struggle to plan inventory, and manufacturers struggle to plan production. Logistics, at its core, is a discipline of predictability. When predictability collapses, costs rise because uncertainty demands buffers, redundancies, and inefficiencies. Yet the AB5 shock was only the first tremor in a sequence of events that would test California's logistics infrastructure. Months later, another piece of legislation collided with the supply chain, this time from the energy sector. Senate Bill 445 imposed new requirements on underground storage tanks at fuel stations, a policy rooted in environmental protection that made sense on paper but unfolded disastrously in practice. The upgrade costs, often reaching $2 million per site, proved fatal to hundreds of small independent stations across the state. The result was the closure of 473 gas stations, many in rural areas where distance itself becomes a barrier. Suddenly, fuel deserts emerged in counties that once relied on these stations for both personal transportation and commercial logistics. Trucks that still operated in California now had to plan not only loads and delivery schedules, but refueling routes, as stretches of highway once dotted with fuel options became sparse. For ordinary drivers, the closure of a gas station is an inconvenience. For logistics, it is destabilizing. Emergency services began reporting longer refueling distances for ambulances and fire trucks. Rural sheriffs complained that patrol operations had to be rescheduled around fuel availability. Add trucking to the equation, and the ripple becomes even more pronounced. Diesel availability is not just a commodity challenge, but a timing challenge. Trucking is governed by hours of service regulations. Detours for fuel eat into legal driving time, compress schedules, and increase operational costs. Then came the refinery closures, yet another variable in a system already buckling. California lost nearly 17% of its refining capacity within a year, as the Phillips 66 Los Angeles refinery shuttered and Valero announced the wind down of its Benicia facility. Refinery closures are not just local events. They are system-wide shocks. A reduction in refining capacity tightens fuel supply, raises prices, and reduces the buffer that allows states to weather disruptions. In logistics, fuel is not a background expense, it is oxygen. Without it, nothing moves. A state cannot lose refineries, fuel stations, and independent truckers simultaneously without consequences. What makes this crisis structurally significant is the convergence. Policymakers pursued AB5 as a labor reform. They pursued SB 445 as an environmental protection. Refinery policy unfolded under the banner of energy transition. Each of these objectives can be debated on its own merits, but logistics does not care about intent, it cares about capacity. Supply chains collapse not from a single blow, but from cumulative strain. California applied strain on labor, strain on energy, and strain on infrastructure simultaneously without designing alternatives to absorb the pressure. The ports felt this convergence most acutely. Their dominance has always been rooted in geography. California sits at the edge of the Pacific, perfectly positioned between Asia's manufacturing engines and America's consumption hubs. But dominance also requires competitive infrastructure. When dwell times extend, when trucking capacity falls, when fuel access tightens, shippers begin to recalculate. And recalculation in international trade is not a theoretical exercise. Ports in Houston, Savannah, and Newark have been aggressively expanding capacity, dredging deeper channels, investing in new cranes, and courting carriers with incentives. In a global logistics environment, stability is currency. California once offered unrivaled stability. Now it offers uncertainty. Shippers and freight forwarders are not ideologues, they are pragmatists. Their clients demand reliability. If California's ports cannot guarantee predictability, they will move freight elsewhere. And indeed, early signs of diversion emerged. Trade publications noted that some trans-Pacific carriers quietly shifted contracts to Gulf and East Coast ports. This did not occur with the fanfare of a political scandal, but with the cold logic of business. Why risk congestion, delays, and fuel scarcity when other states offer consistent throughput? As California grappled with these shifts, the cost of goods in the United States began to reflect the underlying stress. A dysfunctional supply chain translates into inflationary pressure. Retailers operating on just-in-time inventory models faced restocking delays, forcing them to expand inventory buffers. Larger buffers require more warehouse space, more capital, and more carrying costs. Those costs roll downhill to consumers. A product delayed by logistics does not simply arrive late, it arrives at a higher price. Inflation tied to logistics is particularly insidious because it does not respond quickly to monetary policy. Interest rate hikes cannot accelerate container dwell times or reopen fuel stations in the Central Valley. The Federal Reserve can curb lending but cannot conjure diesel out of shuttered refineries or entice independent truckers back into a market that no longer favors them. In other words, the pressures California introduced were supply-side shocks, not demand-side pressures, and supply-side shocks are notoriously resistant to the conventional levers of economic intervention. What makes this unfolding crisis so remarkable is the degree to which it exposes the fragility of modern commerce. Americans are accustomed to walking into stores and finding shelves stocked with goods sourced from across the globe. They do not consider how many nodes of the logistics network must function flawlessly to make that experience possible. A smartphone assembled in Asia might travel on a container ship for 2 weeks, wait on a berth for unloading, cross a terminal on a drayage truck, move to a warehouse, be sorted, palletized, trucked again to a distribution center, and finally reach a store via regional freight. Every link in that chain depends on predictability. When California disrupted trucking fuel and port throughput simultaneously, it disrupted the chain not at a single point, but across multiple nodes, amplifying the effect. Critics of AB 5 argued from the beginning that the law's implementation failed to consider how the trucking sector actually operates. Independent owner-operators are not misclassified employees. They are business owners whose earnings depend on their ability to negotiate rates, control schedules, and manage expenses. Their independence is not merely a contractual classification, but a core aspect of their economic identity. By forcing them into employee status, the state effectively removed the entrepreneurial dimension of their work. For many, that was intolerable. They preferred to leave rather than surrender control of their livelihoods. Policymakers defended AB 5 by pointing to exemptions granted to dozens of professions, arguing that the law was not meant to harm legitimate small businesses. Yet the absence of a trucking exemption speaks volumes about how thoroughly the industry was misunderstood. Doctors, lawyers, insurance brokers, and real estate agents secured carve-outs because legislators recognized their status as professionals. Truckers, however, were treated as laborers rather than entrepreneurs. The irony is that truckers invest more personal capital in their operations than many exempt professions. A Class 8 truck can cost over $150,000, and maintenance alone can consume tens of thousands of dollars annually. Fuel surcharges, insurance premiums, tire replacements, and engine rebuilds create an expense structure far more complex than that of many licensed professionals. But the law reduced them to wage workers in the name of protecting them. While AB 5 was the spark, the larger pattern that emerged reveals something deeper. California has entered a phase of policymaking in which the assumed adaptability of markets outpaces the actual adaptability of real industries. Legislators crafted rules for labor, fuel, and energy transitions without fully accounting for how those rules intersect. The trucking exodus intersected with fuel scarcity. Fuel scarcity intersected with refinery closures. Refinery closures intersected with port diversification pressures. The cumulative effect was not merely regulatory burden, but systemic stress. One of the most striking aspects of the crisis is how little political discourse has grappled with the supply chain dimension. Much of the attention in national politics remains fixated on ideological battles, cultural disputes, and electoral maneuvering. Logistics rarely enters mainstream conversations, except during moments of acute crisis, such as the supply shortages early in the pandemic. Yet logistics is where the economic ecosystem reveals its true vulnerabilities. California's situation demonstrates that a state can undermine its strategic position not through external shocks, but through layered internal policy decisions. The geopolitical implications are also worth noting. The United States depends heavily on Pacific trade with Asia. California's ports serve as the primary gateway for goods arriving from China, South Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. Any disruption to those ports has implications for American competitiveness. If shippers begin rerouting freight to bypass California, the shift could strengthen Gulf and East Coast ports at California's expense. In the short term, this appears as a domestic redistribution of trade flows. In the longer term, it may influence foreign investment decisions about where to anchor supply chains. Port infrastructure expansions are multi-decade bets. If investors believe California has become unpredictable, they will place their bets elsewhere. Domestically, states like Texas and Georgia have been preparing for such opportunities. Houston's port expansions and Savannah's aggressive dredging projects are not incidental. They are strategic moves to position those states as alternative gateways to global trade. For years, California assumed that its geography would protect it from competition. Geography, however, only matters when infrastructure amplifies it. If California's infrastructure becomes unreliable, geography alone cannot preserve dominance. This raises a deeper question about governance. How should a state balance policy ambitions with operational realities? California has positioned itself as a laboratory for progressive policymaking, particularly in labor reform and environmental regulation. Laboratories, however, must consider the interdependencies of their experiments. A policy that reshapes labor classifications must be evaluated not only for its labor impacts, but also for its industrial impacts. A policy that accelerates environmental compliance must be evaluated not only for its ecological benefits, but also for its logistical consequences. Policymakers may argue that transitions are inherently disruptive and that short-term pain is the price of long-term progress. That argument holds only if alternative systems are in place to absorb the disruption. In this case, alternatives were not designed, tested, or deployed before the old systems were constrained. To understand how this plays out on the ground, imagine a refrigerated container arriving at the Port of Los Angeles carrying perishable produce from Chile. The container must clear customs, be unloaded, and depart the port within a narrow window to prevent spoilage. Under normal conditions, an independent trucker would haul it to a cold storage warehouse or distribution center. Once AB5 disrupted trucking capacity, that container might sit longer, increasing the risk of spoilage. Even if spoilage is avoided, delays raise costs and strain trade relationships. Multiply such scenarios across thousands of containers, and the system begins to show stress fractures. The crisis also exposes how little redundancy exists in California's logistics architecture. Redundancy is expensive, and for decades, efficiency has been the governing philosophy of global trade. Just-in-time delivery models minimize inventory and reduce carrying costs, but they depend on flawless movement. When disruptions occur, there is no slack. Critics warn that just-in-time logistics created brittleness, and California's situation validates those concerns. If policy-induced disruptions become frequent, companies may revert to just-in-case models that increase inventory and warehouse demand. This shift, already underway due to pandemic-era shocks, may accelerate as logistics becomes less predictable. What remains unclear is whether California fully recognizes the scale of the shift. For state officials, the economic indicators may appear abstract. Fuel closures, refinery shutdowns, trucker withdrawals, and port diversions. These can be dismissed as temporary fluctuations or transitional turbulence. But for the small business owners at the heart of the logistics chain, the shift is existential. A trucker who leaves California is unlikely to return. A fuel station that shutters in a rural county is unlikely to reopen. A refinery that closes rarely restarts. A shipping route diverted to Houston or Savannah may remain there even after the crisis subsides. Infrastructure and business networks, once reoriented, do not pivot easily. Consumers may not feel the full consequences immediately, but the seeds of future price increases and shortages are being planted. Logistics is a delayed feedback system. When disruptions enter the network, their consequences often emerge weeks or months later. A toy that fails to arrive in time for the holiday season might appear as a missing SKU on a shelf, but behind that absence lies a chain of decisions, delays, and rerouted freight. The visibility is low, but the stakes are high. California's policymakers face a dilemma. Admitting the scale of the logistics crisis would require acknowledging that certain reforms were enacted without sufficient consideration of operational realities. Political narratives rarely reward such admissions. Instead, there may be attempts to patch the system through temporary subsidies, exemptions, or emergency waivers. Whether such measures would be sufficient is uncertain. In the case of AB5, trucker exemptions were requested but not granted during the legislative process. Extending exemptions retroactively would raise legal and political complications. Another dimension of the crisis lies in public perception. For urban Californians living in tech hubs and cultural centers, the logistics network operates invisibly. Goods arrive as if by magic, and the machinery that moves them remains unseen. For rural Californians, logistics is not invisible, it is livelihood. Fuel stations, trucking depots, and agricultural freight routes form the connective tissue of local economies. When those nodes weaken, rural regions feel the pain first. This creates a political asymmetry. The constituencies most harmed by logistics disruptions possess less electoral influence than those insulated from them. Yet even urban Californians will eventually encounter the downstream effects. Rising prices, product shortages, and delivery delays do not respect political geography. The national conversation on inflation has been dominated by debates over monetary policy, fiscal stimulus, and corporate pricing strategies. Missing from that conversation is the role of structural logistics constraints. If California's logistics network falters, the impact radiates across state lines. A disruption in Los Angeles can raise prices in Chicago, Dallas, and New York. The supply chain is not regional, but national. The response from competing states further complicates California's position. Texas has marketed itself aggressively as a business-friendly alternative, emphasizing lower regulatory burdens and robust energy infrastructure. Georgia has pursued predictable port throughput as a selling point for transatlantic and pan-Caribbean freight. New Jersey has leveraged its proximity to population centers to attract East Coast trade. These states are not waiting for California to resolve its crisis. They are capitalizing on it. If freight flows shift significantly, California may face a permanent reduction in its logistical relevance. Losing relevance in logistics is not merely an economic problem, it is a strategic problem. The United States has spent the last decade reevaluating its supply chain vulnerabilities, particularly in light of geopolitical tensions with China. Reshoring, nearshoring, and diversification efforts all depend on reliable domestic logistics capacity. If California once served as the secure Western gateway for Asian trade, any degradation of that role forces companies and policymakers to rethink long-term strategies. The cost of losing that position is not just lost revenue, but diminished influence in shaping the future contours of global commerce. The crisis also challenges assumptions about how environmental and labor reform should be implemented. Advocates of aggressive environmental regulation argue that transitions to cleaner fuels and modernized infrastructure are essential to combating climate change and protecting public health. Advocates of labor protections contend that worker rights cannot be subordinated to business convenience. These arguments possess merit, but the logistics crisis demonstrates that reforms must account for transition paths. A state can mandate new fuel storage standards, but if the assistance programs meant to support compliance stall in bureaucratic limbo, fuel stations will close instead of upgrade. A state can legislate labor transformations, but if it eliminates entrepreneurial business models faster than it creates structured employee-based alternatives, capacity will decline. A state can accelerate energy transitions, but if it shuts down refineries before replacement systems achieve scale, scarcity arises. The underlying lesson is not that reforms are impossible, but that sequencing matters. Transitions require time, capital, and redundancy. Without those, reforms of noble intent can yield consequences that harm not only businesses, but the very public they aim to protect. When supply chains buckle, consumers pay through inflation, workers suffer through layoffs, and rural communities crumble through disinvestment. Progress must therefore be architected rather than assumed. California's situation also forces a broader conversation about the role of the independent contractor in the American economy. For decades, the contractor model has served as an alternative to traditional employment for individuals seeking autonomy. Independent trucking is a prime example, but the model extends across construction, creative fields, consulting, professional services, and skilled trades. If policymakers continue narrowing the legal definition of independent work, the landscape of small business in America will change dramatically. Such a shift may please some labor activists, but risks undermining entrepreneurship at a time when economic dynamism appears to be slowing nationally. Societies that favor stability over flexibility often sacrifice innovation. Societies that favor flexibility over stability often sacrifice security. The challenge lies in balancing both. The responses from within the trucking industry reflect how deeply the independent model is valued. Owner-operators do not view themselves as exploited workers yearning for corporate protection. They view themselves as entrepreneurs who accept risk in exchange for control. Asking them to trade that autonomy for employee status misunderstands their identity. For many, that identity is inseparable from their business. When confronted with the choice of assimilation or exit, they choose exit. The consequence is that California did not convert contractors into employees, it converted contractors into former Californians. Whether the state will adjust its approach remains unclear. Some policymakers may believe the disruptions are temporary and that the market will eventually stabilize. But this assumes that truckers, shippers, fuel operators, and refiners will return once the dust settles. That assumption runs counter to historical evidence. Business relocations are rarely reversed deliberately. They are reversed only when new economic incentives outweigh the cost of return. That requires not only policy change, but restoration of trust. Trust once broken is expensive to repair. If there is any silver lining to the crisis, it is that it has drawn attention to the importance of the supply chain in public life. More Americans now recognize that products do not simply appear on shelves, they traverse networks of astonishing complexity. These networks require skilled operators, robust infrastructure, and predictable regulation. They do not function under stress indefinitely. The more a society depends on logistics, the more it must respect the constraints that govern logistics. California stands now at an inflection point. Its future as a logistics powerhouse is not guaranteed. The state can choose to reassess how its policies interact, or it can continue pursuing fragmented reforms without regard for their cumulative impact. One path seeks balance, the other seeks conviction. Conviction may win legislative victories, but balance sustains systems. As the country watches California navigate this moment, a broader national conversation may follow. States have long competed over taxes, regulation, and business climate. Now they compete over logistics. In a 21st century economy defined by global trade and interstate commerce, the ability to move goods efficiently is a source of power. States that build resilient logistics environments will attract investment, jobs, and influence. States that undermine their logistical capacity will face decline not with dramatic collapse, but with gradual displacement. The true test of California's resilience lies not in its ability to weather short-term turbulence, but in its willingness to adapt. Adaptation requires humility, the recognition that policies can have unintended consequences and that systems can break when pushed beyond their tolerance. Whether such humility exists within the state's political leadership remains to be seen. For now, the truckers who left are gone. The fuel stations that closed are shuttered. The refineries that wound down are silent. The ports that once moved 40% of America's imports continue operating, but under strain and without the certainty that once made them unassailable. The crisis did not begin with chaos, and it will not end with triumph. It will end slowly through shifts in contracts, investments, and shipments, until one day the landscape of American logistics looks different, and Californians wonder how their state lost what once seemed unlosable. In the end, the story of California's logistics crisis is a story of systems colliding with policy. Systems demand continuity. Policy demands change. When the rate of change exceeds the system's capacity to adapt, the system breaks. That is what happened here. It did not break all at once, and it may not break completely. But it broke enough to remind the country that progress without planning is not progress at all. It is wishful thinking with consequences. And those consequences, measured in higher prices, slower deliveries, weakened ports, and displaced workers, are now unfolding not as speculation, but as reality across the highways, refineries, and distribution channels of the largest state in the nation.